Hi, my name is Paige Sanders, and I'm going to be presenting a PowerPoint regarding attachment theory and child welfare. I am in a class of Foundations of Human Behavior at the University of Missouri. Attachment theory and child welfare is important for every social worker to understand and know. We will be touching base on multiple things during this PowerPoint. On this page, it talks about 5 different things we will be touching base on. The family is the fundamental resource for child nurturance and bonding. Parents should be supported in their efforts to care for their children. Attachment theory plays a key role regarding biological parents and children's relationships. And of course, attachment matters. Lastly, family system theory lens. Now, we must understand that the family is the fundamental resource for child nurturance and bonding. It is key to make sure that we support the caregivers in this process. One of the steps by doing this is helping break that cycle of trauma and also understanding that all families that we work with have the potential for change. Now, on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see adverse childhood experiences, which we will later discuss in the PowerPoint and how it correlates as well to bonding. Now, in order for children to be successful with their parents and bonding, parents should be supported in their efforts to care for their children. I have here 3 different steps that we can look at to gain an understanding of how we as social workers can help. The first step is we must be able to increase the caregiver's protective factors. The second step is we must focus on the family functioning and resilience. The third step is focus on the professional, personal, and social supports for the family. These 3 things are key in order for us to support their efforts to care for their children while remaining at home. Now, of course, attachment theory plays a key role regarding biological parents and children's relationships. The best example for a theory for us to look at regarding this is Bowlby's attachment theory. Now, there are 6 bullet points here underneath his picture there that is important for us to understand. The first one is attachment is crucial for children's psychological welfare. Second is infant has built-in propensity to form strong emotional bonds. The third is that it is so necessary for children to have warm, intimate relationships with the mother or caregiver. The fourth is believed attachment forms basis of personality development. Next is caregiver plays an important role in infants' emotional regulation. And lastly, maternal deprivation theory. Attachment matters. These 2 words is so important in child welfare, and every single person that interacts with any type of child and parent must understand that attachment matters. Next, we're going to talk about family systems theory lens. So on the right hand, you can see all kinds of different families. You have 2-parent families with 2 kids, 1 kid, multiple kids, a network of grandparents. And so you can see that we will work as social workers with multiple different type of family systems. So it is important to understand what family systems theory lens is. On the left-hand side, you will see 3 different circles. You will see the larger circle is a collective familial emotion, and then the middle one, the inner circle, is displayed expressed emotions. The littlest one is individual felt emotions. So let's think about that on just for a little bit on what we feel that means. So when looking at family systems theory, there are multiple areas on the right-hand side which you can look at. We will not go into great detail on these, but I do want to touch base on each one just to point them out. So we have the triangular system, the differentiation of self, nuclear family emotional process, marital conflict, dysfunction in one spouse, impairment of one or more children, emotional distance, and family projection process. Now, when looking at this list, I personally can feel that some of this can create trauma in a family. Now, how does trauma relate to bonding and attachment? Also, how does family systems correlate with bonding and attachment? This is an important question that we must ask ourselves when working with families, and particularly families who have children in care. When looking at trauma, one must correlate it with bonding. There is a study out called Adverse Childhood Experiences, also known as ACEs, and this is a 10 questionnaire that you can give families, and it bases the answers on what their childhood trauma is. On the right-hand side, we can see that there is 8 different experiences that one may experience as a child, from physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, parental substance abuse, mental illness, suicide or death, crime or imprisonment. Now, looking at these, if one experiences these as a child, how does it affect you as an adult? Well, each one of these affects one's well-being. In return, can affect the secure attachment bond. So, in other words, how a caretaker's well-being can affect the secure attachment bond, how an infant's well-being can affect the secure attachment bond, how an older child's well-being can affect the secure attachment bond, and lastly, how any caretaker's well-being can affect the secure attachment bond. While we discuss attachment theory, there is one other theory that I would like to discuss that is related to attachment and bonding and is very important when discussing this subject. And that is Ainsworth types of attachment. On here we can see 4 different attachments from secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, ambivalent, and insecure disorganized. Now, next to that, it does talk about the caregiver's behaviors and child's behaviors. So it talks about when an attachment is secure, a caregiver is quickly to react and positively to the child's needs, and also responsive to the child's needs at all times. The child's behavior, in return, is distressed when the caregiver leaves, which shows that bond, is happy when the caregiver returns, and seeks comfort from caregiver when scared or sad. So as you can tell, reading those, it really is important that a child feels secure, and that is part of attachment. Now, the next box is insecure avoidant. The caregiver behaviors may be unresponsive, uncaring, dismissive. Now, child's behaviors in return may be no distress when the caregiver leaves, does not acknowledge when they return, and does not seek to make contact. These are all really good signs for a social worker to be aware of when dealing with families. The next one is that the caregiver responds to a child inconsistently. That means they are not consistent to the way they respond. They may respond in a positive manner sometimes and a negative manner at other times. Now, the child's behaviors in that sense is distress when the caregiver leaves, so it's similar to the secure, but the key is that they are not comforted by the return of the caregiver. Lastly, the insecure and disorganized attachment type is abusive or neglectful, responds in frightening or frightened ways, is how the caregiver behaviors would look like. Now, the child's behaviors would be no attaching behaviors, often appear dazed, confused, in presence of caregiver. Why I wanted to show this is because as we interact with families and with parents, it is important to understand and to be able to point out these behaviors in both the parents and the children to know how we move forward with attachment and bonding. Now, the lack of bonding and attachment can also affect a child and cause trauma. And the reason I really want to talk about this is because many times when children are put in care, they are separated from their parents. And at times they are attached to their parents. And that separation forms a sense of trauma, not only for the child, but for the parent. And so on here, I think it's important to point out these 4 different areas in which trauma can affect a person and a child, and particularly children. So you have cognitive, emotional, physical, and social. And as you can see underneath, it gives a list of all of the different areas in which they can affect. The cognitive, a child who may experience trauma may have delayed language learning difficulties, memory difficulties, reduced ability to focus and concentrate, and then school readiness and academic failure. Emotional is self-regulation of emotion, self-regulation of behavior, poor impulse control, high emotional reactivity. Physical, weakened immune system, changes in brain development, obesity, mental health problems, chronic health issues. And lastly, social. You have aggression, peer rejection, hostile perceptions, and volatile relationships. Now, all of these also correlate with the ACEs that we talked about previously. It is important when we work with families to give families the ACE in order to understand their own trauma in their life. Why bonding and attachment is so important. I thought this was the best example of understanding different personalities. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Charlie Brown, as it is one of my favorite cartoons, and I always feel have the best meanings. As you can see, we have 4 different characters. We have Peppermint Patty, Lucy Van Pelt, which has always been my favorite one, Schroeder, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and Charlie Brown. And with that, each character has a different emotion. Peppermint Patty is secure. Lucy is preoccupied. The piano player is dismissing. And Charlie Brown, as we all know, is fearful. Now, as you can tell, there are arrows pointing. We have high proximity seeking, and then on the left-hand side, we have low anxiety of abandonment. And then on the right-hand side, we have high anxiety of abandonment. Now, one must ask why I put this picture on why bonding and attachment is important. When a child is bonded and attached to their caregiver, they are secure with who they are. So Peppermint Patty is the perfect example of security. Now that we've talked about security and bonding and attachment and gave many different examples, I want to touch base locally so we can take a look at numbers on children in care. As I mentioned earlier, trauma is also induced when a child is taken out of a home. Many times children are taken out of home for multiple reasons. On this, there is a chart that is Boone County removed to foster care during 2019 in April through March 2020. The total removals to foster care is 155. That is a tremendous amount. The average monthly removals to foster care is 129. That is 129 children that are getting put into foster care. That is a systematically induced trauma. This is really a high number. And then you have re-entries to foster care, which is a tremendous amount too. And you can also see our state rate on that as well, which is fairly high. So as you can read through these different removals for the different reasons, you have neglect, you have caretaker drug or alcohol use, physical abuse, caretaker inability to cope, inadequate housing, incarnation, child behavior, abandonment, sexual abuse, non-related foster care first setting, related foster care first setting, pre-adopted home first setting, group home first setting, and so on. Now, when I mentioned the sexual abuse, abandonment, child behavior, incarnation, inadequate housing, physical abuse, caregiver drug and alcohol use, all of those are on the ACEs, which is the childhood effect trauma, and that's how we can measure to see a child's trauma. Here's another chart that shows Boone County children subject to maltreatment reports. So this is kind of like a chart of how many hotlines there are. So the count, which is again tremendous amount, from October 2008 to September 2019, the children subject to maltreatment reports, which is hotlines in other words, is 1,524. And then you go on to different areas of victim reports of neglect, victim reports of physical abuse, sexual abuse, other abuse, victims removed to foster care, non-victims removed to foster care, children subject to alternative response removed to foster care, and so on. These numbers are alarming. Now, what can we do when we look at these numbers? How can we make a difference? First, we got to have a good understanding of what child abuse and neglect is and how to be able to not only understand it, but to be able to recognize it. So in order to do that, we must ensure that we make relationship and environment safe, stable, and nurturing. That is how we help all kids and families thrive. There are 4 different types of child abuse and neglect, as I had mentioned in those charts. We have physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. Now, I do want to point out about 1 in 7 children experienced child abuse and neglect in the last year. This is millions of kids. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I hear those numbers and I see those charts in a county that I work in and a county that I live in, it's extremely alarming. And so I often think, what can we do as social workers for that? As social workers, what we can do is we can help maintain the bond with children, which in return will reduce trauma for both natural parents and children. Now, how do you maintain a bond? Well, the first thought is, of course, we would want to increase visits. Unfortunately, in this area, there are not that many programs that can increase visits besides what they currently have, which is 1 or 2 a week. But what we can do is provide resources to families and children in care that will assist them in increasing their protective capacities while teaching them nurturing skills. And nurturing skills coincide with bonding and attachment. This is every single social workers that is in child welfare should be their goal, is to assist in reducing the impact of system-induced trauma, which is children in care. There's a couple of things that you can do in any county you live in, and that's to reach out to your legislators, policymakers to see what policies are out there regarding child welfare, and particularly child welfare, with foster care and children in care. As well, we can provide an extensive array of purchase services from local and private contractors to help provide services to families who have children in care. And then as we do those, we always want to make sure we continue to assist policymakers in continuing with this change that we all should be working towards. The last page is references that I have used throughout this PowerPoint. I thank you guys for your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me them and I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.